early stage plaster casts are here. So maybe it would be interesting to talk about material for a minute.
Well, yes, thank you, John. I had been dropped into it. I'm not quite sure where. I don't have that much on my mind. Well, first of all, I think it's a great opportunity, and I admire a lot the spirit within which John is trying to make things happen and conversations happen, because I think that conversation and dialogue in architecture is critical, and you'll find that once you get out of college, trying to maintain that dialogue and debate is really difficult, and it becomes, in a way, a secret agenda that you have to pursue, because the tendency of the profession tends to take you away from it. And also, especially in the sort of Anglo-Saxon cultures, to discuss ideas is somehow suspicious. Clients are very nervous if you bring into discussion things which don't immediately relate to time and money and maybe functionality. And of course, architecture is made out of more things than that. So I think while you're at college, I think it's really important to develop a way of talking about architecture and a way of critiquing architecture. I mean, while you're in college, you can sort of rely, I suppose, on professors to tell you whether you're making mistakes or not. But actually, while you're here, what you should be developing is that faculty yourself, because once you get out of here, there's no one to tell you really what to do apart from yourself. And in a way, I think that that's what architecture is. It's the ability to self-criticize, or at least that's what becoming an architect is about. And I think it's a very confusing time in architecture in many ways, and I think especially now we have this financial crisis, I suppose it's even more confusing. Although I don't think you should be daunted by it. I don't think you should be daunted by that, because recessions come and go, and in my experience, in some ways, moments of energetic construction tend to squash atmosphere of debate and dialogue. And on the contrary, maybe these times of slight inactivity give us the opportunity to put back priorities. And I think certainly in the field of architecture, and I would say in the field of culture, priorities have been rather confused. And I think that's what you have to do as students, is to establish priorities and judgments. Because in the end, I think that design is about judgments, and judgments that are felt. They're not, I think we obviously in our craft, the skills that we have to manage involve material, they involve physics, they involve planning, they involve aesthetics, what buildings look like, and design. And I suppose design is the sexy thing, and we're all really excited, I suppose, about making forms and inventing. But what we do is only given significance by the decisions that uphold those ideas. There is, in my opinion, a sort of danger at the moment that we are so influenced by the virtual that we become slightly detached from the real and from things which give meaning to the real. So we can't avoid the fact that we're in a culture at a time when imagery is so powerful. And I'm not just talking about our ability to generate image, but just even the way by which we can somehow sum up images very quickly. We become trained to sort of flick through a television channel, and within a microsecond you know what's going on in each second. Your brain makes up, based on a very small amount of evidence, a small amount of information, what that is about. And that's becoming, I think a problem generally, but it's a real problem in architecture where the qualities of architecture, I think, rely on other judgments. So, talking about materiality, I would more likely to talk about sort of physicality in a way. I think that it's often I'm sort of asked about detailing and materials, and as if because clearly it's something I'm interested in, but to be honest, I'm not that interested in it as a detached thing. I think what's fascinating about architecture is the fact that you have to materialize ideas, and we are very insecure in the way that we develop ideas. And to be honest, we all tell stories. We all invent our own narratives about why we did something to justify that the conclusions that we come to. And I just I go back to what I said at the beginning. I think in a way the rigor by which you can examine your own story, that what you have built up, why this stack of ideas has concluded in that particular arrangement, in that particular consequence, I think is, the quality of that depends on the rigor of your ability to examine the basis of that story, and not to fool yourself and invent stories which are fragile and not sustainable. So, it's I'm sort of running out here.
Well, yeah, but maybe it's to do with the concept and you were saying ideas. Is that I think sometimes, especially in our discussions in the school, we tend to put the cart before the horse in the sense that we think that the concept, the idea, precedes the work. That you've got, in order to do some work, you have to have a concept, and in order to have a concept, you better wait until the concept is delivered to you. But in the classical sense of concept, a concept is something that is confirmed or developed through work. Probably a lot of your talk last night was about the deeper you go in, the further the concept is. So when I said material, I didn't mean material before you start. I meant the material out of which.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there aren't sort of abstract concepts in architecture. The ideas of architecture are within architecture itself. They don't float around somewhere.
So someone like you, you're interested in rooms, for instance. You might talk about windows, or you might talk about doors. You don't see it as just a nebulous thing. It's anchored to the real architecture.
Yeah, I suppose we're now discussing where the architectural ideas come from.
Yeah.
Where do you, when you're scratching around, where do you scratch? And how deep do you scratch? And what are you looking for when you're scratching? And where are you going to find those thoughts? And, there are architects that have become very influential, but I don't think scratch. they land, you know, in a way that there is an attitude towards form making now, which is a fairly autonomous, you know, process. That there are architects that have developed sort of handwriting, a sort of form making, which is, you know, self-referential and has its own energy. You know, and I'm not saying it's all negative. I think that, you know, someone like Geary is like a sort of potter, just, you know, just sort of keeps making things, and he's so used to making things that these autonomous objects, which he will say each time is very much based on the program, very much based on the location, and very much based on the climate. Strangely, they all look roughly the same. But in some ways he's not lying, because what he does is completely pliable. And he's actually incredibly skillful at getting all that other stuff out of the way. I mean, there's a sort of critique that is thrown at Geary is that, you know, he's not particularly interested in the function of the building. I mean, actually he is, because it doesn't really affect him in the same way. Because, you know, if you need to change the building a bit, you know, the third floor needs to be slightly bigger and the fourth floor needs to be slightly smaller, then he just uses his form-making skills to reassemble. Whereas if you have a more rational approach to architecture, you go into crisis as soon as you know, one part of the building has to become bigger, and you don't know how to rebalance. You know, so the whole project has to. You go back to square one. So actually, Geary is quite. You know, I think he's very, very skilled in.
But speaking about one part being bigger, one thing that you've been doing in your career is you've been shifting scale quite a lot. I mean, you would design a cup on a saucer, you would design a couch, you would design quite a large part of the German cultural cluster. You would design a house, or you would design a frock shop, or you would design
because I think you've got to go back to the essential things each time, which is a sort of a point of view.
Yeah.
And I think.
So how do you think about scale? Yeah. I mean, scale of work, just in your hands.
Well, I think the skills are different. I mean, there's no doubt. And I don't. You know, I've done some furniture, but I'm not a furniture designer. I did start off, because I started off my career, I mean, as you know, our generation, we were children of recession times. You know, I came out of architecture school and early practice with very low expectations about what one could build, and for the first 10 years, you know, basically did shops and things. And actually, it wasn't so bad, because I think what was interesting about doing small projects was that you learnt very quickly the effect of things. The problem in architecture, you know, large-scale projects, the distance we have to travel from the first ideas to the realized building is enormous. And in general terms, it's a building of any size is 3 years. I mean, even a house is 3 years. So anything, so, you know, it's between 3 years and 5 years, let's say, is normal. During that process, you've not only got to keep convincing yourself and sort of, you know, examining your own decisions, but every time you look over your shoulder, there's a whole lot of other people that you've got to keep, you know, in line, and who, many of which you've had to persuade at the very beginning what something might be like in 5 years' time. In that process of persuasion and convincing, you don't have much evidence, because you don't have the real thing. You can't come into a room and say, look, you know, here's the blue one, here's the yellow one. Isn't the yellow one nicer? I mean, it's clear, isn't it? I mean, yeah, the yellow one's fine. It's very difficult at the beginning of a project to say, you know, how nice will this wall be if it's in brick, as opposed to, you know, I said, well, I don't know, I don't like brick very much. You know. You don't have the evidence to talk about what something might be like.
And in your world, how much of that is a secret? How much do you talk about that with people?
You mean how subversive is our job?
Yeah.
I think that's a very good point, because I think that we, I think that shows you the depth of our of our weakness, because one tactic is subversion. So you don't tell anybody what you're doing, but you tell them as little as possible. This is Jim Sterling's great thing. Don't explain anything to the client. Just tell them where the door is, tell them where the bathrooms are, just explain, you come in here, you go, don't ever, and this is the problem, we've been brought up with this idea that that dialogue is not only difficult, it's nearly fatal. Because as soon as you open it up, you're starting to bring clients into discussions which you're best to hide. I think that's why the high-tech bunch was so successful. Because if you can turn a building into a structure, then all of a sudden, it's a sort of hedgehog, you can't touch it anymore. Because, Nick Grimshaw was saying, well, because of, the span and the beam has to be like this, and because of that we put the ducts here, and if you say, well, can't you make this no, you can't, because, that's got to span from here to here. So everything's deterministic. So you make something, the buildings that got planning permission in London, against all odds, were sort of high-tech buildings. Nick Grimshaw's Waitrose in Camden Town is sort of weird. You wouldn't, at the same time, if you tried to build a modest, contextual brick building, the planners would have forced you to go sort of pastiche Georgian. But if you put down a sort of high-tech hedgehog, and the planner said, well, why does it look like that? He said, well, because it's spanning here, and these two things have to hold the trusses down, and in order to bring the forces over the roof, you've got to do. So the planner said, oh, fine, because you've either got to take it or not. So those things become, tactical. And I think this is, really central to this, and I think it's very dangerous to be strategic in that sense. One has to be, but the difficulty is you end up trying to develop two stories, your own and the one that you talk publicly about, and it's difficult enough to develop your own ideas. And in my experience, if your ideas are founded enough and they're relevant enough and sort of purposeful enough, then you have a chance of persuading. But also, I think ideas... I was working for the BBC in Scotland, and we had a terrible... the BBC were a disaster as a client, because basically they subcontracted their client role onto developers and project managers. So they sort of hid. They disappeared as a client. And while I was doing a building in Scotland, Richard McCormack was doing a building in Portland Place, the expansion of Broadcasting House. And he was having a really bad time, and he was sort of, calling me to have a good moan, to sort of, so we could both moan together. And there was a point he said, David, I'm so depressed. We had this amazing blue wall running through the whole building, and it was just a wonderful thing, the bastards, if they've cut it out. And I was quietly thinking, well, it's probably a good idea. And I sort of realized that, you have to be really careful about what it is you think these bastards are up to, because you've actually got to make sure that the blue wall that you're spending your life fighting for is really worth it and is fundamental enough. It's a relevant enough idea. And if it's a formalistic idea, which I think that was, I'm being a bit naughty criticizing Richard, because I think he's a good architect and I think he does very good work, and it's not. I'm just using that as an example. Don't tell him. But I had the feeling that this was a sort of architect's formalistic idea that probably deserved to be at least challenged. And in my experience, knowing that you're just going to be challenged so hard on these things, yes, you've got two ways. You're either subversive and you sort of try and describe things in one way and do them in another, or you sort of run head on. And I would have to say that in the end, maybe I'm an optimist, but I do believe that in the end, if you believe in things strongly enough, because we are in a world where there's so little done through conviction. If you have conviction, and that conviction is well grounded, so it's not just a conviction of just willfulness and formalism and sort of peak, but it's a conviction that, and you've got ideas which are, you know, somehow ideas that are not just obsessed with architecture as a sort of pursuit of formal ideas, but architecture as something that can resonate beyond just form making. I'm not explaining that very well. Maybe I'll come back to that. But in my experience, if your ideas are robust enough, then you have a very good chance of getting people to support them.
Last night you quoted Michelangelo when he said you should be able to roll a statue down a mountain and at the bottom nothing of any significance would have been lost. In other words, that in him maybe by the process of a hard life or something, but the thing that remains is really the essence of what it was intended, and the rest is extra.
The test of a good sculpture, roll it down a mountain.
Yeah.
And I think what he's trying to say is exactly that all the floppy bits and all the, you know, because that's what he was doing through his life. I mean, finally at the end, you have these wonderful pieces that he does. It's as if he's found the form inside the stone, and somehow there is this incredible relationship between the material itself and the form that he's trying to find. And there are no superfluous bits. And I've often said that to my students, you know, that imagine the wind blows very hard, you know, through your project. You know, blows off all the bits that, you know, we don't need probably. And
all
architecture.
The blue walls. All the blue walls.
Well, maybe probably it would blow off probably the blue wall with anything that stood. But I do think that what one is looking for is something that's not constructed in a fragile way. It's, you know, if architecture is something which is built up, I don't mean just the building itself, but the ideas are built one on top of the other. Then you've got to make sure that those are substantial ideas, and those ideas are robust enough to kick them around. And at the end, a project's not dependent on one thing or another. I mean, as architects, we do have to sort of pretend it is, because you do have to get intensity into a project. You do have to realize this idea with a certain intensity, and therefore details matter, and the way that it's built absolutely matters. But I think, in my opinion, that's about substance, you know. And I think what we are in a sort of crisis about in architecture is the question of substance of idea and substance of matter, because architecture has always depended on a notion of permanence, and we are not quite so sure anymore in our modern times, where you know, my children tell me to change my telephone after 6 months because they say, you know, you're still using that telephone, it's out of date. You know, technology is changing so fast. We throw things away so fast. We consume things so fast. So, you know, everything else seems to be ephemeral. And there's a tendency to believe that architecture is part of this, you know, transient attitude. Therefore, you feel really old-fashioned talking about, you know, permanent values, because it seems to be in conflict with the prevailing mood. So, you know, we have people like Rem Koolhaas, in a way, trying to reflect, or, you know, many architects are no longer in a way trying to give order, they're trying to somehow capture the zeitgeist in this, their buildings. The reality is, if you see any building, you see the excavation and the foundation works of any building, however temporary it sort of pertains to be, we're still digging fucking great holes in the ground and pumping mud out. I mean, it's not pumping concrete in. So it's an illusion that things are permanent or, you know, are less permanent. But there is a general, we are in an intellectual climate that is more confused about values and, you know, the status of values. And therefore, that has an obvious influence on the way that we prioritize decisions in architecture.
I'm going to open it to the floor just for some questions, but just before I do, because you just said one thing, you said I might come back to that in a minute, just in case you didn't come back to it in a minute. You were touching just a little earlier on resonance of architecture as opposed to the flourish of design or something. That architects themselves must believe in more than their own contribution to architecture. Last night I described that as you attending to the culture of architecture. Can you say something about literacy or believing, or, you know, just that wider sense of architecture? As opposed to my architecture.
There was a sort of, you know, I think the modern movement was founded on the premise that form was generated by function. And this became the mantra for the modern movement. And this was wrapped into the idea that there was a radical, you know, there was a revolution in a way in architecture at the beginning of the 20th century, where architects tried to sever themselves off from this obsessive stylistic period at the end of the 19th century. There was a battle of styles where, you know, so after the First World War, this great tragedy, then we were going into the future. So architecture had to reflect that. So it broke, substantially broke with history and only looked forward and came up with, in a way, some of the most beautiful you know, poems of architecture. I think of early Corbusian villas and, I mean, wonderful projects. I mean, the early modern movement in this radical position, you know, produced extraordinary buildings that were desperate to demonstrate their disconnection from history. So flat roofs and horizontal windows and buildings that stood on columns, everything that, you know, if buildings always had pitch roofs, let's not have pitch roofs. If buildings had vertical windows, let's have horizontal ones. If buildings stood on the ground, let's stand them in the air. Let's do everything that disconnects us from that. Then I think there was a sort of period in the, well, I don't want to give a whole history of modern architecture. It seemed to me that you know, when I came out of school and then, you know, early years of practice with working with other architects, it was shocking to me how hated modern architecture was, and modernism was hated. But modern architecture, especially, Prince Charles weighed in and gave validity to, you know, the taxi driver's view of modern architecture. And to be honest, he wasn't completely wrong. You know, sort of late 70s, early 80s. You go around most English towns at the time, you know, every new building was crap. It was really, so you couldn't really blame people for disliking architecture. And I found that really sort of shocking. And John, you know, talk about, you know, the sort of subterfuge. I mean, in a way, that's where it comes from, this idea that one is so disconnected from the culture that you are operating within. And that, for me, was really sobering. And therefore, I discovered, in a way, that in order to bridge a dialogue, you had to find things which people would understand. So the first building I did was this Birmingham museum in Henley. And it was 2-pitch roofs, and clad in wood. And in a way, it was quite conservative. But I realized that there was no other way of having everybody there, there would have just been riots in the streets if I had tried to put a radical alien object there. So it just seemed to me, why can't we as architects also make some gesture towards sentiment and towards things which we've always regarded as being somehow thin and superficial? But obviously they're not, because they're deeply held, maybe more emotional than intellectual, but still.
So that's to do with continuity, really.
Yes, and it was really interesting that as soon as I did a building which seemed to perform a double role as a piece of modern architecture and as a piece of architecture that people in the area sort of liked. It was a sort of shock that there was a piece of modern. So therefore, the dialogue. I didn't have to talk about window frame details or things like that. I just had to talk about intent, an idea. And I think if you can find ideas in projects that somehow locate buildings, not just in terms of their typology or their construction, but also in a sort of social way, then I think, and I think especially as our ability to control the public realm seems to get less and less, and I think buildings have to become a little bit more opportune in terms of what they offer.
Okay, so I want to invite, there won't be time for everyone to ask a question, but, since this is a short half-hour talk. But I want to invite some people to ask questions. There's a whole ticket of people at the back who might want to have their voice heard, especially from students. That's all right.
Can I ask them?
Yes.
Sorry, do you think that
right in the front row.
yeah, sorry, that architects are very quick to say disconnect themselves with the social realm? That maybe we should consider, if we go towards design the theatre, speak to musicians, something like the Independent Group, where the Smithsons were completely enamoured by modernism but didn't know how to bring it forward in the UK, and so they sat down with artists, and maybe should we introduce that into the institution that architecture is?
I think we have to use our naivety, because I think you, in the essay I just read, the interview I read of yours with Frampton, he quotes Caesar as saying we're specialists of non-specialists. And I think we are, and I think that what I find very interesting, the privilege of being an architect, is that you are dropped into organizations that you know nothing about, in worlds that you know nothing about. And I work for, Dolce & Gabbana or something. I've got no real passionate interest for, frogs. But once you start understanding what they need to do and what the issues are, it's quite interesting. And therefore, you have to, in a way, peel back what you think the issues are, and what the problem is, and what the purpose is. I think that's what I was going to say. Instead of, functionality is somehow a dead end. What is the function of a living room or a bathroom or a shop? It doesn't actually tell you much more. But purpose is another thing. What are you trying to do, and what are the essential issues? And therefore, I think what's quite nice about the tasks that we're given, and one time it's a university, another time it's a fashion company, another time it's a wine, a vineyard, another time it's a museum, and you can't be an expert in that, but what you can be is a sort of unfolder of issues. And I think that's the other task of the architect in terms of their dialogue, is that we have to unfold and give oxygen to issues that we think might be important. And the funny thing is, in my experience, when you go to meetings, the clients want to talk about architecture, and you want to talk about what they do. You know, they think you're coming in and they say, right, so where's all these, you know, where are all the drawings? And they say, well, we'd like just first of all to talk about, you know, how do you work? And they're hugely disappointed because, you know, they think this is a great opportunity. And I think it's very, very important to immerse yourself, and certainly that's something we do in our office a lot. That we, you know, I always describe it as putting everything on the lawn. You know, you go to an organization and you don't take their description of themselves for granted. You actually, you test very naively, you know, why do you do this? Why do you need this? Why do you... And in that description, you can actually start to understand what priorities are, and you can start building up a case which then becomes part of the dialogue, because you can start to see what the pertinent issues are.
Helpful answer, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Lisa.
And do you think that dialogue outside the dialogue between the architect and client should be done by buildings or by the architect and speaking to it? And writing, should the buildings be communicating?
Well, you're talking about when the building's done. Yeah, that point is dead. I mean, it's not, there's no script. You can't, you know, I always say to my teams, you know, you can't put a plaque up on the outside of the building saying, we had a really bad client, we didn't have enough money, the window contractor let us down, so please, you know, when you come into this building, be aware. You can't do that. Whatever is built is the story. Whatever ideas are visible to and perceivable and manifest are the ideas. Anything that's not manifest and is not perceivable is pointless. I mean, people taking, you know, I was in Liebeskin's Jewish Museum in Berlin, and there are guides taking around. Well, the architect intended, you know, you may wonder why there are so many crosses. Well, apparently what the architect meant by this was, and you know it's rubbish because it was just a consequence of two lines intersecting each other. But someone is trying to explain the complex narrative of this building. Well, at that point, I think it's pointless. If it's not something that you feel, then it's not an idea. But I think we're talking about something else, which is the articulation of the idea in the formulation of the building is a different issue.
Yeah.
I was really interested last night about the point you made about with the soot on the columns in the Noise Museum, about the line between style and bias and aesthetic. And was
talking about the soot on the columns.
The soot on the columns, yeah, in the Noise Museum. And the how you were saying there was a particular rule that you would start through the whole building where you peel back the layer of dirt or whatever, and then you reinterpret the form maybe or the aesthetic. But that with the column, because it had a different feel and you liked it, that you considered it for that point. But I wonder in your own work, when it comes to the line between when you're making a form or organization, or like you said about Coalhouse, where it's integrating the zeitgeist, how do you make that judgment? Where does the form begin? Where does the organization or the idea take hold?
I think what you're looking for, in, you know, there's a magic moment in design, I think, when the thing starts to take on its own life, and you tend to take a more guardian role over it. You know, it's like it starts to walk, and then it's a matter of pointing it in the right direction. I always find that until that point, it's always frustrating because you never quite know what this thing wants to be. And gradually, it starts to become something, and I find that a really interesting moment that you can sense that it's sort of established a series of ideas which are all conspiring together in a good way, and then it's a matter of not screwing it up. You know, then it's a matter of trying to make the ideas support. You know, every time you get to the next issue, you're checking it against how you think this animal nearly is behaving or wants to behave or could behave. So I think you are, you're trying, what I can't explain is how do you get to that point, because I think that's a very accidental and messy process. I think designing is incredibly messy, and I think one has to be braced for that, or in a way enjoy that. It's very difficult, I think, sometimes in one's office to make sure that people don't lose their nerve, because I find it very dangerous to jump onto formal solutions too early. I think as architects we're desperate to find a form and then get on with it. And it's the same in an office. It's terrible in an office because you've got 8 kids who are all desperately wanting to know what this thing's going to look like, because then they can really get on and start designing. So there's a tendency always to grab something at the first opportunity, and I think that what we have to learn as architects is to exist in this slightly foggy moment without losing nerve, because I think that if you jump too quickly, you may not have created the right series of ideas that come together.
Thank you. Last question before I go to you. John. No, you said before I go to you. No, I said last question before I go to you. So I know you're going to be the last question. It's just good that the students get a chance to ask, because when you ask a question, then you remember the answer, as that serious man will remember the answer. Yeah.
Do you think the intellectual justification and the story sometimes gets in the way of the physicality of architecture? So the stories we tell and the concept.
Yeah, I do. I think, and that's why I think the story has to be robust. And I think that you've got to be able to explain it to your mother. I think that
her mother's probably an architect.
Yeah. Philosopher. On the basis your mother is not a philosopher or an architect, I think that is a test. And I must say, the thing that I enjoyed in Berlin, perversely, in a sort of masochistic way, is that I had to explain the project to everybody, to politicians, to people that hated me for what I was doing, to conservationists, to project managers, and continuously having to order the project through description. And that description had to be pretty straightforward. It couldn't be, we're doing this and therefore we're doing that. It had to always keep coming back to very clear and consensually understood notions. And I must say Germany is a bit more patient for concepts and ideas than the Anglo-Saxon world is. But I still think, and I'm working with a developer at the moment, and I'm quite surprised how, if the idea is sort of strong enough and big enough, how they'll sort of, go for it.
You.
Well, I think it's an easy question. You talked last night about the capacity of architecture to give you goosebumps. And I wonder, would you talk about a piece of architecture that gives you goosebumps? And maybe if there's time, also something outside of architecture that gives you goosebumps.
Well, the second part, sailing with my children is always a great relaxation and thrill, and the time I get very excited, I suppose. I don't know, in architecture there's lots of buildings that one enjoys and gets, where one really witnesses the authority of architecture, and I think that's what I tried to describe. That and I tried to say also, it is disappointing how few modern buildings do that to you, or at least, let's crank it down a stage. If we are operating in you know, with material that is spatial, you know, it's atmospheric, we can control where light comes in, you know. Think about how many artists are trying to move in to confiscate those qualities for themselves. You know, they're bored with working on a flat surface put onto a wall. They're doing rooms and flooding rooms with oil and doing all things. I mean, moving into a much more physical thing. I mean, how disappointing is it that so many modern buildings have no physical quality whatsoever? I mean, how many buildings that get built from day to day even come close to expressing physical qualities? You know, crap brickwork, horrible windows, no sense of threshold, awful door handle. I mean, horrible space. You know, I mean, just absolutely nothing. I mean, I'm not talking about architecture by good architects. I'm just talking about the world within which we live. Because I think there's another problem. As there is a focus on architecture as a sort of star thing, we focus more and more on singular buildings. And in a way, the state of architecture has become measured by, you know, Zaha's latest building or Norman Foster's latest building or whatever. In the meantime, the general environment is just left alone. I mean, when I was a student, we talked about cities, we talked about, you know, there was an idea about cities. I mean, now it's about objects. You know, it's as if we've given up our anxiety about, I mean, in England, there's, you know, architects don't do housing hardly at all. You know, we're not out there. Most good architects are not doing office buildings. You know, London has changed enormously in the last 15 years, and to be honest, I can't really think of how much improvement at a sort of urban level or an infrastructural level, you know, apart from the odd things, but it hasn't, you know, if this has been a golden period for London architecture, I mean, it doesn't manifest itself in the way that, let's say, Georgian London, you know, left an incredible, you know, contribution, not just to singular buildings, but to the assembly of spaces and the idea of, you know, what a city is. So I think that's the point that concerned me. That, you know, there are singular buildings that engage architecture's potential, but how depressing it is that, you know, 90% of building production doesn't come anywhere near it. You know, and that's also the fault of part of the profession that does that stuff. It's a fault of the planning process that doesn't, you know, encourage sufficiently or discourages. It's a fault of clients who are not willing to have the patience to be good clients. You know, and again, you know, my experience in Germany, it was quite interesting to see that the culture is less tolerant of crap. You know, they expect slightly better things. So if we expect better, it's sort of, you know, it's like, you know, a German car has to be at a certain level. Otherwise, they just take it back. You know, if the door doesn't do that Mercedes clunk, you know, they won't buy it because that's what they expect a car door to sound like. And it's the same in building, actually, and it's quite nice because it means that even the builders police themselves a little bit because, you know, in England you have to, you know, the paint, you know, the paint is on the door frame and on, you know, and you've got to go around and say, but why didn't you paint? Oh yeah, we'll sort that out. Well, why do you need me to tell you not to paint over the wooden door? I mean, couldn't the guy with a paintbrush sort of say, well, I shouldn't do that, should I? Because as soon as you've got to then instill quality, and you're the only guardian, and that's how it feels like as an architect in an Anglo-Saxon culture. You're the only person around the table that is arguing for those values. And I think unless we can find a way by which those values are more commonly shared, then we've got no chance. And clearly example is the best thing. I mean, there's no better thing than for architects to produce good buildings, and there are enough architects producing good buildings that at least, you know, keep the flag flying. And it is interesting that people that have been in that process, you know, on a university campus with, you know, and they've been involved in a good architect building a building, and, you know, they then become, you know, evangelic about, you know, how good architecture can be and how good architects are. You know, people just need a good experience that they can start understanding that better.
There's a beautiful moment last night after David's lecture. The Office of Public Works took him out to dinner, and so I would say. But the line of Office of Public Works on one side of the table, and they were individually and collectively saying to David, how great to meet a good architect who really pays attention. And having heard quite a lot of that across the dinner, it was just very good as we were leaving. David said that there's dozens and dozens of good architects. There's good architects all over the world. What's really rare is good clients. Which just finished off the evening very well. It's the reason to say that, and the reason that I said this about attending to the culture, is because in my head I'm reminded that of an interview I once heard with Colm Tóibín, and Colm Tóibín was saying it's all very well for wrote the Butcher Boy, Patrick
McKay.
Patrick McKay. It's all very well for Patrick McKay because he's burning up inside and he doesn't care about books, and maybe he never read a book, and he just had to write the book, you know, and out comes the book, and the book is burnt out of him or something. Colm Tóibín says, see, it's different for me. I've got Henry James and Jane Austen to worry about. You know, because what Colm Tóibín does is he reads books. So he is an author who attends to the culture and believes in it. It's not kind of bursting out of him like the alien out of the chest, you know. He says, fuck, did I do that? I think that if you don't mind me characterising you, David, or trying to put you in the wrong kind of corner, I think that you're more in the Colm Tóibín corner than you are in the Patrick McKay corner. Not that you wouldn't be up to a fight with Patrick McKay, but there's something about that, isn't there? That there's something that beyond us and behind us, and indeed in front of us, there's the whole ongoing subject, the wonderful subject of architecture, which is worth paying attention to.
Well, unless you think it's part of culture, then it's what's and that's what they.
Then it's momentary, yeah. And that's what you're all here to participate in. I did see, when you invite someone to do a lunchtime talk, you also have to get them to lunch. I have to close this session.